Sometimes the words we speak in jest carry more weight than the ones we mean. In a small frontier town, a lonely, stable girl named Etta Rose joked to a mysterious cowboy that she'd give him strong sons if he'd stop being such a nuisance around. Her horses. She thought she was just teasing the tall, quiet stranger who'd been drifting through Dry Hollow, but Harlan Tate wasn't just any cowboy. He carried something ancient in his blood, something that made her careless words into a promise the old spirits wouldn't let either of them forget. When strange things started happening around town and Etta began having dreams of children she'd never met, she realized her joke had awakened forces neither of them understood. What happens when a simple jest becomes something that changes two lives forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dry Hollow's main street, painting the weathered wooden buildings in shades of gold and amber that reminded folks of better times. Dust motes danced in the slanted light streaming through the stable doors, where Etta Rose worked, her calloused hands moving with practiced grace as she brushed down Old Molly, the town's most stubborn mare. The rhythmic sound of bristles against horsehair mixed with the distant murmur of early morning conversations from the general store across the way. Etta had been tending these horses since she was 12 years old when Widow Macready took her in after the fever claimed both her parents. That was 8 years ago now, and in all that time she'd never once complained about the work. There was something honest about horses. They didn't lie or make promises they couldn't keep. They didn't whisper behind your back or look at you with pity in their eyes like some folks in town still did. "Morning, Etta," called Doc Brennan as he made his way past the stable, his medical bag swinging gently at his side. The old physician had delivered half the babies in Dry Hollow and patched up the other half when they got into scrapes. His hair had gone white as fresh snow over the years, but his eyes remained sharp and kind. "Morning, Doc," she replied, pausing in her work to wave. "Mrs. Henderson's mare doing better, right as rain, thanks to your advice about that poultice." He tipped his hat. "You've got a gift with these animals, girl. Your grandmother would be proud." Etta's hand instinctively moved to the worn silver ring she wore on a chain around her neck, her grandmother's wedding band, the only thing she had left of the woman who'd raised her mother. The ring had tarnished over the years, but sometimes in certain light it seemed to shimmer with an inner warmth that made her think of stories her mother used to tell about love that lasted beyond lifetimes. The morning routine continued as it had for years. Sheriff Coleman rode by on his daily patrol, nodding toward the stable with the respectful acknowledgement he gave to all the hard-working folks in town. Widow Macready emerged from her boarding house across the street, shaking out a rug with more force than necessary, her way of showing the world she was still strong despite her 73 years. But today felt different somehow. The horses were restless, shifting in their stalls and nickering softly to each other as if they sensed something approaching on the horizon. Even Old Molly, usually calm as a summer pond, kept turning her head toward the road that led into town from the eastern plains. That's when Etta heard it. The steady clip-clop of hooves on hard-packed earth, but slower and more deliberate than the usual traffic. She stepped to the stable door and looked down the dusty main street, shading her eyes against the morning sun. The rider emerged from the heat shimmer like something out of a dream, or perhaps a half-remembered nightmare. He sat tall in the saddle of a massive black horse, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed to stretch longer than the sun's angle should have allowed. Even from a distance, Etta could see he was uncommonly large, not just tall, but built with the kind of solid strength that spoke of hard work and harder living. As he drew closer, more details became clear. His hair was dark as prairie soil, after rain, pulled back from a face that looked carved from the same stone as the canyon walls. His clothes were simple, worn leather chaps, a faded blue shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. But everything about him suggested a man who knew his own mind and didn't much care what others thought of it. The horses in the stable grew, more agitated as the stranger approached. Thunder, the young stallion in the corner stall, began pawing at the ground and snorting. Even gentle Belle, who usually greeted everyone with hopeful wickers, backed into the far corner of her stall. "Easy, a girl," Etta murmured, but her own heart had begun beating faster. There was something about this man that set every instinct on edge, though she couldn't name exactly what. The rider stopped directly in front of the stable, his pale grey eyes meeting hers across the dusty space. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath. Even the ever-present prairie wind died to stillness. "Morning," he said finally, his voice low and rough like distant thunder. "Name's Harlan Tate, looking for a place to board my horse for a few days." Etta found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "We've got stalls available. 2 bits a day includes feed and water." He nodded and dismounted with fluid grace despite his size. Standing on the ground, he was even more imposing, easily 7 feet tall, with hands that looked capable of gentling wild horses or breaking iron bars with equal ease. Yet when he moved toward his horse to untack the saddle, every motion was careful and controlled. "What's got them so spooked?" Harlan asked, nodding toward the agitated horses. "Don't rightly know," Etta admitted, stepping aside as he led his black gelding toward an empty stall. "They're usually friendly with newcomers." As Harlan passed by her, carrying his saddle and gear, Etta caught a scent that was utterly foreign, yet strangely familiar, like sage and storm winds and something else she couldn't identify. The silver ring against her chest grew warm, warmer than it had any right to be from just her body heat. "They sense things we don't always notice," Harlan said quietly, settling his horse into the stall. The black gelding calmed immediately, though the other horses continued their nervous dancing. "Animals are smarter about some matters than people. Give them credit for." There was something in his tone that made Etta look at him more closely. His profile, outlined against the morning light streaming through the stable doors, seemed almost otherworldly. The angles of his face were too sharp, too perfect, like something an artist might imagine rather than nature might create. "You planning on staying in Dry Hollow long?" she asked, busying herself with hanging up the bridles to avoid staring. "Depends," he replied. "Sometimes a place calls to you, makes you want to put down roots. Other times, you know you're just passing through. And which is this?" He turned those unsettling grey eyes on her again, and for a moment Etta felt as if he could see straight through to her soul. "Haven't decided yet." The rest of the morning passed in relative quiet. Harlan settled his horse and paid for 3 days' boarding, though he didn't say where he planned to stay himself. Etta went about her usual tasks, but she found herself stealing glances at the stranger who moved through the stable with such careful, deliberate steps. By noon, word had spread through Dry Hollow's handful of streets that a giant of a man had ridden into town. Widow Macready made it her business to stop by the stable under the pretense of checking on her own horse, Buttercup, but Etta could see the curiosity burning in the older woman's sharp blue eyes. "Big fellow, isn't he?" Mrs. Macready commented, not bothering to lower her voice, though Harlan was clearly within earshot, tending to his horse just 2 stalls away. "Size doesn't make the man," Etta replied diplomatically, though she had to admit the widow had a point. "No, but it sure makes you wonder what he's running from," Mrs. Macready said, with the bluntness that had made her both feared and respected. "In town for decades. Men that size don't usually travel alone unless they've got good reason. Doc Brennan arrived shortly after, ostensibly to check on a horse with a slight limp, but Etta noticed how his gaze kept drifting to Harlan's imposing form. Even Sheriff Coleman found an excuse to patrol past the stable twice before lunch, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. If Harlan noticed the attention, he gave no sign. He worked quietly, speaking softly to his horse and nodding politely. When introduced to the various townspeople who found reasons to visit the stable throughout the day, But Etta caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. Those storm-grey eyes following her movements with an intensity that made her skin tingle with awareness. As the sun reached its peak and the heat began pressing down on the town like a heavy blanket, Etta found herself alone in the stable with the mysterious stranger. The horses had finally settled into their afternoon drowsiness, though they still gave Harlan's stall a wide berth. "You've got away with them," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the comfortable silence. Etta looked up from the bridle. She was mending. "Been doing this work for 8 years. They're used to me." "It's more than that." He stepped closer, and again she caught that strange, wild scent, sage and storm winds, and something indefinable that made her think of vast open spaces and star-filled skies. "They trust you. That's not something you can earn through routine." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "My grandmother always said animals could sense a person's true nature. Maybe they just know I mean them no harm." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." She was. Etta's fingers found the ring again, the metal warm against her palm. "She passed when I was young, but my mother used to tell me stories about her. Said she had a gift for understanding things that others couldn't see." Something shifted in Harlan's expression, a flash of recognition, or perhaps longing that was there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "What kind of things?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Etta shrugged, suddenly self-conscious about sharing family stories with a stranger. "Oh, you know how old-timers are, always talking about spirits in the wind and signs in the sky, probably just fanciful thinking." But even as she said it, she remembered the way her grandmother's ring had grown warm when Harlan first walked into the stable. She remembered the way the horses had reacted and the strange dreams that had been haunting her sleep lately. Dreams of children with dark hair and grey eyes, calling her name across vast prairie distances. "Maybe," Harlan said quietly, "or maybe some folks are just more open to seeing what's always been there." The afternoon stretched long and drowsy, filled with the comfortable sounds of horses munching hay and the distant murmur of daily life in Dry Hollow. But underneath it all, Etta felt a current of anticipation, as if the very air was holding its breath for something momentous to occur. She had no way of knowing that before another day passed, her carefully ordered world would be turned upside down by a few careless words spoken in jest. She had no way of knowing that the tall stranger in her stable carried secrets older than the town itself, or that her grandmother's ring would soon glow with a light that had nothing to do with reflected sunshine. All she knew was that Tate's arrival had stirred something deep in her chest, a longing she'd never acknowledged, and a sense of destiny she'd never believed in. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Etta Rose couldn't shake the feeling that her real life was just about to begin. The second day of Harlan's stay dawned grey and restless, with clouds gathering on the horizon like an approaching army. The wind carried the scent of rain and something else, something electric that made the horses pace in their stalls and set Etta's nerves on edge. She'd slept poorly, her dreams filled with images she couldn't quite grasp upon waking. Children's laughter echoing across empty plains, a man's voice calling her name through prairie winds, and always, the sensation of something important waiting just beyond her understanding. Harlan was already in the stable when she arrived, brushing down his black gelding with long, methodical strokes. He'd removed his shirt in the morning heat, revealing a chest and arms marked with old scars that told stories of hard living. But it wasn't the scars that made Etta catch her breath. It was the way he moved, with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural in a man so large. "Morning," she said, trying to keep her voice steady as she set about her daily tasks. "Morning, Etta." The way he said her name sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Storm's coming." She glanced toward the stable doors where the sky had darkened considerably. "Looks like it. Good thing the horses have shelter." "Some storms bring more than rain," he said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made her look at him sharply. Before she could ask what he meant, Thunder chose that moment to act up. The young stallion had been getting increasingly agitated whenever Harlan was near, and now he began kicking at his stall door with enough force to rattle the entire structure. "Thunder, stop that!" Etta rushed toward the stall, but the horse was beyond reasoning. His eyes rolled white with fear or rage, and his powerful hooves struck the wooden door again and again. "He's going to hurt himself," she muttered, reaching for the latch. It was a foolish move. Thunder in this state could easily trample her, but she couldn't stand to see any animal in distress. A large hand closed over hers before she could open the stall. Harlan's touch was surprisingly warm, and the moment his skin met hers, something extraordinary happened. The silver ring around her neck flared with heat, and Thunder immediately calmed, dropping his head and blowing softly through his nose. But it was more than just the horse's sudden peace that stole Etta's breath. The moment Harlan touched her, she felt something click into place inside her chest, a recognition so deep and fundamental that it bypassed thought entirely and went straight to her bones. "How did you—" she began, but her words trailed off as she looked up into his face. His grey eyes had darkened to the color of storm clouds, and she could see something flickering in their depths. Surprise, recognition, and something that looked almost like fear. "I should go," he said abruptly, releasing her hand and stepping back. But the retreat came too late. Whatever had passed between them in that moment of contact couldn't be undone. "No, wait!" The words tumbled out before Etta could stop them. "I don't understand what just happened, but you felt it too. It wasn't a question. I felt something." She pressed her palm against her chest, where her grandmother's ring still radiated warmth. "What are you?" Harlan's jaw tightened. "Nothing you want to get involved with." The evasion sparked Etta's temper, a flash of the stubborn streak that had helped her survive 8 years of orphaned independence. "Don't you dare patronize me, Harlan Tate. I may be just a stable girl, but I'm not stupid. There's something different about you, something that affects the animals and makes my grandmother's ring heat up like a poker in a fire. The least you can do is give me an honest answer." For a long moment he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of Thunder's now peaceful munching and the distant rumble of approaching thunder. "You want honesty?" he said finally. "Fine. I'm cursed, Etta Rose. Have been for longer than you've been alive. I bring trouble wherever I go, and people who get too close to me end up paying for it. That honest enough for you?" Instead of frightening her, his words only strengthened her resolve. There was pain in his voice, old and deep, and something in her responded to it with fierce protectiveness. "Cursed how?" she demanded. "The kind that makes a man live too long and see too much," he said wearily. "The kind that ties him to things he can't control and forces him to wander alone for decades, watching everything he cares about turn to dust." The wind outside had picked up, rattling the stable doors and sending dust devils dancing across the empty street. Etta could feel electricity building in the air, making her skin tingle and her hair stand on end. "Well," she said, crossing her arms and fixing him with her most determined stare, "if you're cursed to wander alone, then I'd say you're doing a poor job of it, considering you're standing here talking to me." Despite everything, that drew a surprised laugh from him. "You're not afraid? Should I be? Most sensible people would be. Then it's a good thing I've never been particularly sensible." She stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his storm-grey eyes. "Besides, if you were really dangerous, you wouldn't have calmed Thunder just now. You would have let me get trampled." "Maybe I should have." The words stung, but Etta could hear the self-loathing beneath them. This was a man who'd been alone too long, who'd convinced himself he was poison to everything he touched. "Maybe," she agreed. "But you didn't, and maybe that says more about your so-called curse than you want to admit." Thunder chose that moment to whicker softly, and both Etta and Harlan turned to see the stallion watching them with unusual intelligence in his dark eyes. The horse stepped forward and gently nuzzled Harlan's shoulder, the first time he'd made Friendly contact with the stranger. Well, I'll be, Etta breathed. He's never done that before. Harlan stared at the horse in amazement. They usually run from me. All animals do. Not these ones, not anymore. She gestured around the stable, where all the horses had gathered at the front of their stalls, watching the pair with calm interest. Look at them, Harlan. Do they look afraid to you? Before he could answer, the storm that had been building finally broke. Rain began hammering the stable roof with sudden violence, and a flash of lightning lit up the interior with stark white light. In that moment of illumination, Etta saw something that made her heart skip a beat. There was a black stone hanging from a leather cord around Harlan's neck, half hidden beneath his shirt. As the lightning flashed, the stone pulsed with its own inner light, a deep, warm glow that seemed to answer the electricity in the air. "Your stone," she whispered. "It's glowing." Harlan's hand flew to his chest, covering the pendant. "You can see that? Clear as day. What is it?" "Something I should have gotten rid of a long time ago." His voice was heavy with regret. "Something that marks me as different, as other. Something that makes promises I never meant to make and binds me to fates I never chose." The thunder crashed overhead, shaking the stable to its foundations. In the midst of the sound and fury, Etta found herself thinking about her grandmother's stories, tales of spirit marriages and ancient pacts, of love that transcended death and promises that echoed across lifetimes. "What if," she said slowly, the words forming even as the thought took shape, "what if it's not a curse at all? What if it's just waiting for the right person to share it with?" Harlan's eyes widened in shock. "Etta, don't!" But she was already speaking, the words pouring out with a boldness that surprised even her. "I'll tell you what, Harlan Tate, you stop stomping around my stable like a wounded bear, scaring my horses and brooding about your mysterious curse, and I'll give you strong sons who can carry whatever burden you're afraid of bearing alone." The moment the words left her lips, the world exploded. Lightning struck so close that the thunder was instantaneous, a deafening crack that seemed to split the very air. Every horse in the stable whinnied in unison, but it was a sound of recognition, rather than fear. The black stone around Harlan's neck blazed with sudden brilliance, and Etta's grandmother's ring grew so hot it nearly burned her skin. But most shocking of all was the wind that rose from nowhere, circling them both in a whirlwind of dust and hay, and something that felt ancient and powerful and utterly alive. The wind carried voices, whispers in languages Etta didn't recognize but somehow understood, speaking of bonds and promises and love that endured beyond death. When the wind died and the unnatural light faded, they stood staring at each other in stunned silence. The rain continued to hammer the roof, but inside the stable everything felt different, changed, as if some fundamental shift had occurred in the very fabric of reality. "What did you just do?" Harlan whispered, his face pale with shock and something that might have been hope. Etta touched her grandmother's ring with trembling fingers. It had cooled now, but she could still feel its warmth pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. "I think," she said slowly, "I just kept a promise I didn't know I was making." The storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving the air crisp and clean with the scent of rain-washed earth. But the strange electricity that had charged the atmosphere during Etta's impulsive declaration lingered, crackling between her and Harlan like invisible lightning. For 3 days after that moment in the stable, they moved around each other with careful politeness, both acutely aware of the words that had been spoken and the inexplicable response they had triggered. Harlan continued his quiet work with the horses, but Etta noticed he never strayed far from her side. When she climbed the ladder to the hayloft, he positioned himself below, as if ready to catch her should she fall. When she carried heavy buckets of water, he appeared beside her without being asked, taking the burden from her hands with gentle insistence. It was Doc Brennan who finally forced the conversation neither of them seemed willing to start. "You look tired, girl," he said on the fourth morning, finding Etta alone in the stable while Harlan had gone to the general store for supplies. Been having trouble sleeping? Etta paused in her brushing of old Molly, her hands stilling on her mare's neck. The truth was she'd barely slept since the storm. Every night brought dreams so vivid they felt more like memories. Visions of children with Harlan's grey eyes and her own stubborn chin calling for their mama across windswept prairies. She'd wake with tears on her cheeks and an ache in her chest that felt like homesickness for a place she'd never been. Just restless, I suppose, she said finally. Doc Brennan's weathered face creased with concern. Restlessness is natural when big changes are coming. The question is whether you're ready to face them. What kind of changes? The old physician was quiet for a moment, studying her with eyes that had seen too much of life's mysteries to dismiss anything as impossible. Tell me about your grandmother's ring, Etta, the one you wear around your neck. Instinctively, her hand moved to her throat where the silver band rested against her skin. Since the storm, it had maintained a constant, subtle warmth that was both comforting and unnerving. It belonged to my grandmother, Mary Rose Morrison. My mother said she wore it every day of her married life, even after my grandfather passed. And what did your mother tell you about how they met? Etta frowned, searching her memory for details that had always seemed more like fairy tales than family history. She said it was an unusual courtship, that my grandfather wasn't from around here, that he was different somehow, that their wedding wasn't held in the church but out on the prairie under the stars. Different how? I'm not sure. Mother always said he was uncommonly tall, uncommonly quiet, that he had a way with animals and growing things that seemed almost magical. She looked up sharply as a thought struck her. Why are you asking about this, Doc? Before he could answer, Harlan's broad frame filled the stable doorway. He carried a small bundle wrapped in worn leather, and his expression was grave as he approached them. Doc Brennan, he nodded respectfully. Etta. Mr. Tate, Doc replied. I was just asking Etta about her family history, specifically about her grandmother. Something flickered in Harlan's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of a suspicion. Mary Rose Morrison, he said quietly. Born Mary Rose Caldwell. Etta stared at him. How could you possibly know her maiden name? Instead of answering directly, Harlan unwrapped the bundle in his hands, revealing a small leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the morning light. As he held it, the pouch emanated the same warm glow that had surrounded his stone pendant during the storm. This belonged to my great-uncle, he said slowly. He gave it to me before he died, along with instructions I didn't understand at the time. Said I'd know when to use it, said I'd recognize the signs when they appeared. What kind of signs? Doc Brennan asked, his voice carefully neutral. Harlan's gaze found Etta's, and she felt that now familiar electric connection spark between them. A woman who could see the spirit light, horses that calmed at her touch as well as mine, dreams of children who exist beyond the veil of time. Etta's breath caught. You've been having the dreams too, for 3 nights running. Dreams where I know their names, where I've taught them to ride and helped them take their first steps. Dreams where you sing them to sleep with lullabies I've never heard but somehow know by heart. The medicine pouch in his hands pulsed with brighter light, responding to their shared confession. Doc Brennan watched with the calm acceptance of a man who had delivered too many babies and eased too many deaths to doubt the existence of forces beyond normal understanding. The old stories, he murmured. I wondered if they might be more than legend. What old stories? Etta demanded, frustration making her voice sharp. Everyone keeps speaking in riddles, hinting at things I don't understand. If there's something I need to know about my family, about what's happening to me, then I have a right to hear it plainly. Doc Brennan exchanged a look with Harlan, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, the physician nodded. Your grandmother wasn't the first woman in your family to make a spiritual bond with someone like Harlan, he said gently. My own grandfather was the territorial doctor, when your great-grandmother, Elizabeth Caldwell, married a man named Joshua Morrison during the winter of 1847. The wedding took place on the prairie under unusual circumstances, and afterward, strange. Things began happening around their homestead. Strange how? Crops grew in soil that had been barren for years. Sick animals recovered overnight. Women who'd been told they could never bear children found themselves with child. The land itself seemed to prosper wherever they walked together. Etta felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible, is it?" Harlan asked quietly. "Look around you, Etta. Since the storm, have you noticed anything different about the horses? About the stable? About yourself?" Now that he mentioned it, she had noticed changes. The horses were calmer, healthier, their coats gleamed with unusual luster, and even the older animals seemed to move with renewed vitality. The stable itself felt different too, cleaner somehow, as if the very air had been purified. And as for herself, she felt stronger, more energetic despite her restless nights. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more clear. It was as if some barrier between herself and the world had been lifted. "The medicine pouch responds to you," Harlan continued, extending it toward her. "It hasn't glowed like this since my uncle gave it to me 20 years ago. He said it would only awaken in the presence of the right woman, the one meant to share the burden and the blessing of our bloodline." "Burden," she whispered. "We live longer than we should, Etta. We're tied to the land and the spirits that dwell in it. We can heal and help and protect, but we can never truly settle in one place for long. Not unless we find the woman who can anchor us, who can make us fully human again." The pouch pulsed warmly in her hands as she took it, and immediately she understood its contents without looking inside. Herbs for healing, stones for protection, seeds that would grow in any soil, tools for a life she'd never imagined but somehow recognized. "And you think I'm that woman?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "I think," Harlan said softly, "that you made a promise 3 days ago that awakened something in both of us, something that's been waiting longer than either of us has been alive." Etta closed her eyes, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like her grandmother's shawl. When she opened them again, both men were watching her with expressions of concern and hope. "What happens if I say yes?" she asked. "What happens if I say no?" "That," Doc Brennan said with a gentle smile, "is entirely up to you to decide. The decision should have been impossible to make." Everything rational in Etta's mind screamed that she should thank Harlan politely, return his strange glowing pouch, and pretend the past few days had been nothing more than an elaborate fever dream. She was a practical woman who'd learned early that survival depended on keeping her feet firmly planted on solid ground. But the dreams made rational thought difficult. Each night they grew more vivid, more detailed. She would find herself standing in a kitchen she'd never seen before, sunlight streaming through gingham curtains onto a wooden table where she was packing lunch pails for children whose faces she knew as well as her own reflection. A boy with Harlan's serious grey eyes and her stubborn chin, carefully spelling out words in a worn primer. A girl with dark braids who laughed like summer rain and collected smooth stones in the pockets of her pinafore. In these dreams, her hands bore the calluses of different work, not just the rough patches from handling horses and hay, but the specific marks of kneading bread, churning butter, tending a vegetable garden that flourished beyond all reason. She would wake with the taste of well water on her lips and the scent of prairie sage in her hair, but it was the carved wooden horse that finally convinced her she wasn't losing her mind. She found it on the 5th morning after the storm, sitting on the windowsill of her small room above the stable. It was no bigger than her palm, carved from what looked like oak, worn smooth by countless small hands. Every detail was perfect, from the flowing mane to the delicate hooves to the gentle expression in the painted eyes. Etta had seen it before. In her dreams, the little girl with dark braids carried it everywhere, cradling it against her chest during thunderstorms and feeding it pretend oats from her tiny hands. "Where did this come from?" she asked Harlan when she found him grooming, his black gelding in the pre-dawn quiet of the stable. He looked up from his work, and she saw her answer in the sudden stillness of his expression. "You recognize it. The little girl in my dreams has one just like it, exactly like it." She turned the horse over in her hands, noting the initials carved into the base. "HT, you made this 3 nights ago. Carved it in my room at the boarding house while I couldn't sleep." His voice was hoarse with exhaustion. "I kept seeing her face, kept hearing her asking for a horse of her own. I know it sounds mad, but my hands seem to know exactly how to shape it." "It doesn't sound mad," Etta said quietly. "Not anymore." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both studying the small wooden figure that seemed to bridge the gap between dreams and waking life. Finally, Harlan set down his brush and faced her fully. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about what accepting this bond would mean, about what you'd be giving up. I'm listening. You'd have to leave. Dry Hollow eventually. The gift we carry. It's too noticeable if we stay in one place too long. People would start asking questions about why you never seem to age, why everything you touch prospers beyond reason. We'd have 5 years, maybe 10 at most, before we'd have to move on." The thought of leaving the only home she'd ever known sent a sharp pang through Etta's chest. But as she looked around the stable, at the horses who had become her family, at the town that had taken her in when she had nothing, she realized that home wasn't really a place. It was the feeling of belonging, of being needed and valued. And somehow, impossibly, she'd begun to feel more at home in Harlan's presence than she'd ever felt anywhere else. "What about children?" she asked. "In the dreams, we have children. They'd inherit the gift," Harlan said carefully, "but they'd also inherit the burden. They'd grow up knowing they were different, knowing they'd never have the luxury of putting down permanent roots. But they'd have each other. They'd have parents who understood what they were going through." "Yes," his voice softened. "They'd never be alone the way I've been alone." The wooden horse felt warm in Etta's palm, almost alive. She thought about the little girl in her dreams, the way she laughed with pure joy as she played with her imaginary horses. The way the boy carefully sounded out words, his face lighting up with pride when he managed a particularly difficult passage. "How long have you been alone, Harlan?" 63 years since my uncle died. Longer than that, since I've had anything resembling a family." The number staggered her. Looking at him now, she would have guessed him to be 35 at most. But there was something ancient in his eyes, a depth of experience that spoke of decades of solitary wandering. "That's too long for anyone to be alone," she said firmly. Sheriff Coleman chose that moment to arrive for his morning rounds, his boots crunching on the stable floor as he approached them. But instead of his usual brisk greeting, he stopped short. When he saw them standing together, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Morning, Etta, Mr. Tate." His gaze moved between them, taking in their obvious intimacy, despite the careful distance they maintained. "Everything all right here?" "Fine." "Sheriff," Etta replied, though she could hear the slight tremor in her own voice. Coleman's eyes narrowed as he noticed the wooden horse in her hands. "That's fine craftsmanship. Don't see work that detailed very often." "Mr. Tate carved it," Etta said, then immediately wondered why she'd felt compelled to explain. "Did he now?" The sheriff's tone remained neutral, but Etta caught the sharp look he gave Harlan. "You planning on setting up as a toy maker, Mr. Tate?" "Just something to pass the time," Harlan replied calmly. "I see. Well, time's a funny thing, isn't it? Some folks have too much of it, others not nearly enough." Coleman tipped his hat to Etta. "You take care of yourself, girl. There's been talk around town, and not all of it's friendly." After he left, Etta felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What kind of talk? "The kind that always follows when people notice something they can't explain," Harlan said grimly. "Your horses are looking too healthy, your crops are growing too well. Widow McCready mentioned that her arthritis hasn't bothered her since she..." Started buying eggs from the chickens that roost near your stable. That's good news, isn't it? To us, yes. To people who've lived with disappointment and hardship their whole lives, it might seem suspicious. They'll start wondering what's different, what's changed, and eventually they'll start looking at us. The warning in his words was clear. If they continued down this path, if she accepted the bond he was offering, they would both become objects of scrutiny and possibly suspicion. In a frontier town where superstition ran as deep as the wells, being different could be dangerous. But even as the rational part of her mind catalogued the risks, another part, the part that had grown stronger since the storm, whispered that some things were worth any danger. "There's something else," she said suddenly, remembering a detail from her dreams that she'd dismissed until now. In the dreams, we're not always alone. There are other people like us. Other families who understand. We have friends, neighbors who share the same gifts. Harlan's eyes widened with surprise. You see that? Sometimes, a settlement of sorts, but not like any place I've ever seen. Houses that seem to grow from the earth itself, gardens that flourish in impossible abundance. Children playing games that bend the very air around them. The Blessed Valley, he breathed. I'd heard stories, but I never believed. My uncle claimed there was a place where our kind could live openly, without fear or secrecy. A place where the old covenant between spirits and mortals was still honored. Then it's real. If your dreams show true, then yes. Hope flickered in his storm-grey eyes like lightning on the horizon. Etta, if such a place exists, we wouldn't have to keep moving. We could build a real home, raise our children among people who would understand and protect them. The wooden horse seemed to pulse with warmth in her hands, and suddenly Etta could see it all clearly. Not just the isolated wandering she'd feared, but a community of people like them, bound together by gifts that were blessings rather than curses when shared with understanding hearts. How do we find it? I don't know. But if we're truly bonded, if the dreams we're sharing are visions rather than fantasies, then perhaps the path will reveal itself when we're ready to walk it. As if summoned by their conversation, Widow Macready appeared in the stable doorway, moving with a sprightliness that had been absent from her step for years. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth, and her usually stern expression was softened by something approaching contentment. "Brought you some fresh biscuits," she announced, setting the basket on a nearby hay bale, "and wanted to thank you for whatever you've been doing different around here. I slept through the night for the first time in months, and my old bones feel 20 years younger." She paused, studying Etta's face with eyes that missed nothing. "You've got a glow about you, child. Haven't seen you look this settled since you were small." "I feel different," Etta admitted. "More like myself than I've ever felt before." "Good. Life's too short to spend it fighting against your own nature." Mrs. Macready's gaze shifted to Harlan, taking in his careful posture and the respectful distance he maintained from Etta despite the obvious connection between them. "And you, young man, you've got the look of someone who's found what he's been searching for." "Yes, ma'am, I believe I have." "Then stop tiptoeing around each other like you're afraid to break something precious," she said with characteristic bluntness. "Some things are strong enough to handle a little honest affection." With that pronouncement, she bustled out of the stable, leaving Etta and Harlan staring after her in amazement. "Did she just give us permission to court?" Etta asked, unable to keep the smile from her voice. "I think she did more than that," Harlan replied, moving a step closer. "I think she just told us to stop being fools." For the first time since his arrival in Dry Hollow, he reached out and touched her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek with infinite gentleness. The wooden horse in her other hand grew warm, and she felt that familiar electric connection spark between them, stronger now than ever before. "Etta Rose Morrison," he said softly, "will you walk this path with me, wherever it leads?" She thought of the dreams of the children who would never exist without this choice, of the community of understanding souls waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. She thought of 63 years of loneliness and the chance to ensure that no one else would have to endure such isolation. Most of all, she thought of the feeling that had settled in her chest the moment he'd touched her hand, the sense of coming home to a place she'd never known she was missing. "Yes," she whispered, standing on her toes to press her lips to his. "Yes, I will." The abandoned mission church sat at the edge of Dry Hollow like a monument to forgotten faith, its adobe walls weathered by decades of prairie wind and rain. Most folks avoided the place, claiming it gave them an uneasy feeling. But Doc Brennan had always found peace among its crumbling walls and broken pews. It was there, 3 days after Etta and Harlan's first kiss, that he made the discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. "I've been thinking about your grandmother's stories," he told Etta, as he led her and Harlan through the church's heavy wooden doors, "about the unusual circumstances of her marriage. Something's been nagging at me, some half-remembered detail from my grandfather's journals." The interior of the church was dim and dust-laden, shafts of sunlight streaming through holes in the roof to illuminate faded murals on the walls. But it was toward the altar that Doc Brennan led them, to a wooden chest that had somehow survived. "The years of neglect. My grandfather was the territorial doctor here for 40 years, he explained as he lifted the heavy lid. He kept meticulous records, not just of births and deaths, but of anything unusual that occurred in his jurisdiction. The chest contained dozens of leather-bound journals, their pages yellow with age. Doc Brennan selected one with practiced ease, its cover marked with the year 1847. "Here," he said, opening to a page marked with a ribbon. "December 15th, 1847. Witnessed most extraordinary ceremony today in the prairie 5 miles north of town. Elizabeth Caldwell, age 19, joined in spiritual matrimony to Joshua Morrison, age unknown. Ceremony conducted not by any recognized minister, but by the old Kiowa medicine woman Standing Bear, who claimed the union was foretold by the spirits of the land." Etta felt her breath catch. "That's my great-grandmother's name, Elizabeth Caldwell." "It gets more interesting," Doc continued, turning the page. "The bride wore a silver ring that seemed to glow with its own light during the ceremony. The groom carried a black stone that responded to her presence. Most remarkable of all, the moment they spoke their vows, the very ground beneath them began to bloom with wildflowers, despite the frozen earth and harsh winter weather." Harlan's hand moved instinctively to the spirit stone around his neck. "The same stone. It has to be." "But how is that possible?" Etta asked. "If this happened in 1847 and your uncle gave you the stone 20 years ago, the stone doesn't belong to any one person," Doc Brennan explained, continuing to read from the journal. "Spoke with Standing Bear after the ceremony. She explained that certain objects carry the essence of ancient pacts between her people and the spirit world. The stone and ring are paired artifacts, she said, designed to find their way to the souls meant to honor the old agreements." He looked up at them both, his weathered face grave with the weight of understanding. "Your great-grandmother wasn't the first woman in your family to make this bond, Etta. According to these records, it goes back generations. Caldwell women and the men they're destined to marry, all the way back to the first treaties between the native tribes and the spirits of the land." Etta sank onto a broken pew, overwhelmed by the implications. "You're saying this was always going to happen? That I never had a choice?" "No," Harlan said firmly, settling beside her. "You always had a choice. The artifacts find their way to the right people, but they can't force love or commitment. They can only present the opportunity." Doc Brennan nodded his agreement. "Your great-grandmother could have refused Joshua Morrison. Your grandmother could have sent away the man who eventually became your grandfather. You could have told me to leave town the day I arrived. The bond only forms when both people choose to accept it." Etta thought about the moment she'd made her teasing promise to Harlan, the words that had seemed to come from nowhere. Had they really been her choice, or had some ancestral memory guided her tongue? "But it feels like destiny," she said softly. "Maybe destiny is just another word for the courage to choose what your heart already knows is right, Harlan suggested, taking her hand. Maybe we're all meant for something, and the lucky ones are the ones who recognize it when it appears. Doc Brennan turned to another entry in the journal. There's more. According to my grandfather's notes, Joshua Morrison wasn't just any drifter. He was part of a group, men and women blessed by the spirits, but cursed to wander until they found their bonded partners. Once married, they were granted the ability to settle in special places, sanctuaries where they could live openly and raise their children without fear. The Blessed Valley, Etta breathed. From my dreams, one of several such places according to the records. Hidden settlements throughout the territories where the old agreements between spirits and mortals still hold sway. Doc Brennan's eyes gleamed with excitement. The amazing thing is, I think I know how to find them. He pulled out a folded paper tucked between the journal's pages, a hand-drawn map marked with symbols that seemed to shift in the dim light of the church. Standing Bear drew this for my grandfather before she left the area. She said it would only make sense to those who carried the spirit gifts that the landmarks would reveal themselves to the right eyes. Harlan studied the map carefully, his finger tracing routes that seemed to pulse with faint energy. These symbols, I've seen them before, in dreams carved into rocks during my wandering. I always thought they were just random markings. They're waypoints, Doc Brennan explained, signs left by others like you to guide those who come after. A hidden road network connecting all the sanctuary communities. As they examined the map together, Etta noticed that her grandmother's ring had begun to warm against her chest, responding to something in the ancient paper. When she reached out to touch one of the symbols, it flared briefly with silver light. It's responding to you, Harlan said in wonder. The ring is showing you the path. But even as excitement built in her chest, Etta felt a stab of sadness. What about Dry Hollow? What about the people here who've become my family? Doc Brennan's expression softened with understanding. Change is never easy, especially when it means leaving behind everything familiar. But sometimes staying in one place means stunting your growth, denying yourself the chance to become who you're truly meant to be. Besides, he added with a gentle smile, who says you can't come back to visit? The spirits blessed you with gifts for a reason, to help and heal wherever you go. Dry Hollow will always benefit from having known you, even if you can't stay forever. Outside the church, they could hear the sounds of daily life continuing, horses whinnying, children playing, adults going about their business. Normal human sounds that reminded Etta of everything she'd be leaving behind. But as she looked at the map in Harlan's hands, as she felt the ring's warm response to the ancient symbols, she realized that she wasn't really leaving her old life behind. She was simply expanding it, growing into something larger than she'd ever imagined possible. When would we go? She asked quietly. Not immediately, Harlan assured her. The dreams need to settle first, our bond needs to strengthen, and we'll need to prepare the people here for our eventual departure. How long? A few months, perhaps, long enough to ensure the transition is gentle for everyone involved. Doc Brennan carefully refolded the map and handed it to Harlan. This belongs to you now. When the time comes, it will guide you home. As they walked back toward town together, Etta marveled at how much her world had changed in just over a week. 7 days ago, she'd been a simple stable girl with no prospects beyond caring for horses and dreaming of something more. Now, she was part of an ancient lineage, bonded to a man who carried the blessings and burdens of the spirit world, destined for a community she'd only glimpsed in dreams. It should have been terrifying. Instead, for the first time in her life, she felt truly alive. Ix, the lightning-struck oak, stood alone on the hill north of town, its massive trunk split down the middle by some long-ago storm, but still somehow alive, its branches reaching toward the sky with stubborn determination. Widow Macready had brought Etta there on a crisp morning, 2 weeks after the discovery in the church, claiming she had something important to show her. "Your grandmother brought me here once," the older woman said as they climbed the gentle slope, her breath coming easier than it had in years. "Right after she married your grandfather. Wanted me to see where her own grandmother had stood when she took her vows." Etta felt her pulse quicken. This is where Elizabeth Caldwell was married, the very spot. Though the tree was whole then, according to the stories. The lightning came later, during your grandmother's wedding night, split it right down the middle but didn't kill it, just like the bond between your family and theirs has survived every storm that's tried to break it. As they reached the base of the great oak, Etta gasped. Growing from the split trunk was a single branch that seemed to glow with inner light, its bark smooth and silver bright despite the rough scarring around it. The branch was carved with symbols that matched those on Doc Brennan's map, and it pulsed with the same warm energy she felt from her grandmother's ring. "It's beautiful," she breathed, reaching out to touch the glowing wood. The moment her fingers made contact, visions flooded her mind. Images of her great-grandmother standing in this same spot, radiant in a simple white dress, as she spoke vows that echoed across time. Images of her grandmother, Mary Rose, repeating those same words decades later. And now, impossibly, she could see herself and Harlan standing beneath the oak's protective canopy, their own voices joining the chorus of promises that had been made in this sacred place. "The spirits marked this tree," Widow Macready explained softly, "made it a living record of every bond forged between your bloodline and theirs. Each woman who stood here has left her mark, and now it's waiting for yours." "How do you know so much about this?" Etta asked, still staring at the luminescent branch. The older woman's expression grew thoughtful. "Because I was here the night your grandmother married. I was her best friend then, young and foolish and half in love with the idea of romance. I thought she was making the biggest mistake of her life, marrying a man she'd known for barely a month." "But you were wrong?" "I was wrong about a lot of things." Mrs. Macready's voice carried the weight of old regrets and hard-won wisdom. "I thought love had to be safe, predictable, something you could plan and control. I couldn't understand how she could throw her life away on a man who claimed to carry ancient curses and spoke of traveling to places that existed only in legend." "What changed your mind?" "Watching them together over the years. Seeing how they complemented each other, how their bond made both of them stronger and more complete than they'd ever been apart. The way he looked at her like she hung the moon, and the way she trusted him absolutely, even when the path ahead was uncertain." Etta thought of Harlan, of the way he'd changed since their bond began to form. The careful distance he'd maintained at first had given way to a natural intimacy that felt as comfortable as breathing. He anticipated her needs before she voiced them, steadied her when she stumbled, shared the burden of heavy work without being asked, and she found herself doing the same for him, sensing his moods, offering comfort when old memories troubled him, helping him believe that his long years of solitude were finally over. "There's something else you need to know," Mrs. Macready continued, "about why your grandmother chose to stay in Dry Hollow instead of seeking the hidden communities that Doc Brennan mentioned. She stayed by choice. She and your grandfather talked about leaving, especially after your mother was born. They worried about raising a child who might inherit their gifts in a place where such things weren't understood. But in the end, they decided their purpose was here, to be guardians of this sacred place, to ensure that when the next bonded pair appeared, they would find the guidance and support they needed." The implications of this revelation settled over Etta like a warm blanket. "They stayed for me, for this moment. Your grandmother always said the spirits work in patterns, that every choice creates ripples that affect future generations. She and your grandfather gave up their chance at a hidden paradise because they believed their daughter's daughter would need this place to be ready for her." Tears stung Etta's eyes as she understood the full weight of the sacrifice that had been made for her benefit. Her grandparents had chosen love over safety, duty over desire, ensuring that when her time came, she wouldn't face it alone. and unprepared. "But I'm still going to leave," she said softly. "I'm going to abandon everything they worked to preserve." "No, child." Mrs. Macready's voice was firm. "You're going to fulfill it. Your grandmother didn't stay so you could repeat her choices. She stayed so you could make better ones. She and your grandfather planted seeds here that will continue to grow long after you're gone." As if to prove her point, they heard voices approaching from below. Harlan appeared first, climbing the hill with his easy ground-covering stride. Behind him came Doc Brennan, and behind him, surprisingly, Sheriff Coleman. "Ladies," the sheriff said as they reached the oak, touching his hat brim respectfully. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion, but Doc here convinced me I needed to see something." "The branch," Doc Brennan said simply, pointing to the glowing wood that had captured Etta's attention. "It's been getting brighter over the past week. People in town are starting to notice." Indeed, even in the full daylight, the branch's luminescence was unmistakable. It pulsed with a steady rhythm that seemed to match Etta's heartbeat, and when Harlan approached, it brightened noticeably. "Been sheriff here for 20 years, Coleman said, his weathered face creased with wonder. "Never seen anything like it. But my grandmother used to tell stories about this tree, about the spirits that lived in it, and the promises they witnessed. Always thought they were just tales to keep children from wandering too far from town." "They're more than tales," Harlan said quietly. "The tree is responding because our bond is strengthening. Soon it will be strong enough for the final ceremony, and then you'll leave," the sheriff said. It wasn't a question. "We'll have to," Etta replied. "Our presence here is already causing changes that people will notice. The longer we stay, the more questions there will be." Coleman nodded slowly. "Can't say I like the idea of losing you, girl. You've been good for this town, good for the people here. But I've been around long enough to recognize when something's bigger than my personal preferences." He paused, studying the glowing branch with the careful attention of a man used to weighing evidence. "How long do we have?" "A month, perhaps 2, Harlan answered. "The dreams are getting stronger, more detailed. I think the spirits are preparing us for the next phase. Then we'd best start preparing the town," Doc Brennan said practically. "People need time to adjust to the idea, need to understand that this isn't abandonment but transformation." As they began making plans for Etta's eventual departure, she found herself looking at each of these people: the widow who had become a surrogate mother, the doctor who had guided her through the most confusing period of her life, the sheriff, who had always treated her with respect and protection. They were the family she'd found after losing her parents, the community that had shaped her into the woman she'd become. Leaving them would break her heart, but staying would break something more fundamental. The destiny that had been generations in the making, the chance to become part of something larger and more meaningful than she'd ever imagined. The lightning-struck oak swayed gently in the prairie wind, its glowing branch casting dancing shadows on the ground below. Soon, very soon, she would stand beneath its protective canopy and speak the words that would bind her to Harlan forever. And after that, whatever came next, they would face it together for the first time since this journey began. That felt like enough. The blood moon rose like a crimson eye over the prairie, casting everything in shades of copper and shadow. Etta had been restless all day, her grandmother's ring burning against her skin with such intensity that she'd finally removed it from its chain and held it in her palm, where it pulsed with light that matched the strange lunar glow. She found Harlan waiting for her at the lightning-struck oak, his own spirit stone blazing with answering fire. But it was what lay beside him on the ground that made her breath catch. A leather pouch she'd never seen before, decorated with beadwork that seemed to move and shift in the moonlight. "Where did that come from?" she asked, settling beside him. "On the blanket he'd spread beneath the tree. It appeared in my room this afternoon," he said, his voice tight with an emotion she couldn't identify. "Just materialized on my bed like it had always been there. When I touched it, He stopped, shaking his head as if trying to clear it of unwelcome thoughts. "What happened when you touched it?" Instead of answering directly, he opened the pouch and withdrew its contents. A pendant made of blood red, stone that seemed to pulse with its own inner heartbeat. The moment it emerged into the moonlight, Etta's grandmother's ring flared so brightly that she nearly dropped it. "They're connected," she breathed. "The ring and that pendant. They belong. Together." "More than that," Harlan said grimly. "When I held the pendant, I remembered things that aren't my memories, saw places I've never been, spoke with people I've never met. And through it all, there was this woman." "What woman?" He turned to look at her, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the crimson moonlight. "You, Etta, but not you as you are now. You as you were in 1847. The words hit her like a physical blow. "That's impossible, is it? Look at your ring. Really look at it under this moon." Etta held up the silver band and gasped. In the blood moon's light, she could see engravings on its surface that had never been visible before. Delicate script that spelled out words in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. "Until death and beyond," she whispered, reading the ancient text. "Soul to soul, life to life, love eternal." "Elizabeth Caldwell's wedding ring," Harlan said softly. "And this," he held up the red pendant, "belonged to Joshua Morrison. My great-uncle never told me the whole truth about what I'd inherited. You're saying we're the same souls, yes, reborn, reunited, drawn together by bonds that death couldn't break." His voice carried a mixture of wonder and something that might have been fear. "The dreams we've been sharing aren't visions of possible futures, Etta. They're memories of the life we lived before." As the words sank in, fragments of memory began surfacing in Etta's mind. Not the distant, dreamy recollections she'd attributed to inherited family stories, but sharp, vivid experiences that felt as real as her own childhood. She remembered standing in this same spot over 70 years ago, speaking vows to a man who looked exactly like Harlan, but called himself Joshua. She remembered the feel of his hands, larger than any normal man's, but infinitely gentle. She remembered the way he'd carved wooden toys for children they'd planned to have together. "We died," she said suddenly, the memory hitting her with devastating clarity. "Before we could complete the bond, before we could have our children. There was a fire." "The winter of 1848, Harlan finished. "A blizzard trapped us in our cabin for days. When the wind finally died down, we tried to reach the town for supplies, but our horse panicked. The sleigh overturned, and you—" His voice broke. "You were thrown into the river. I tried to save you, but the ice was too thin. We both went under." "But you didn't die," Etta said, more memory flooding back. "Not completely. You were caught between worlds, cursed to live but not truly alive until you returned." He reached for her hand, and the moment their skin touched, both the ring and pendant blazed with light so intense it turned the night to day. "I've been waiting for you for over 70 years, Etta, wandering from place to place, aging slowly, watching everyone I cared about grow old and die while I remained caught in this limbo. But why don't I remember everything? Why did it take the blood moon to show me the truth? Because you did die completely. Your soul was free to be reborn, to live a new life without the burden of past memories. The spirits gave you that gift, the chance to choose this path freely without being influenced by what came before." Etta stared at the pendant in his hands, understanding finally dawning. "But now that I know what happens, do I become Elizabeth again? Do I lose who I am as Etta?" "I don't know," he admitted. "All I know is that the pendant appeared today because the time has come to choose. We can complete the bond that was interrupted 70 years ago, accept the full weight of our shared destiny, or you can choose to remain as you are. Etta Rose Morrison, stable girl, free to live whatever life you want without the burden of ancient obligations. The memories will fade, the connection will weaken, and he swallowed hard. "I'll continue wandering until this form finally fails, or until the spirits decide to release me." The choice should have been simple. She was Etta, not Elizabeth. She had her own dreams, her own identity separate from some woman who'd lived and died before her grandparents were born. But as she looked at Harlan, really looked at him, seeing past the careful control to the desperate hope he was trying to hide, she realized that choice was an illusion. "Those children in our dreams," she said slowly, "they're not possible. Futures. They're the children we were meant to have before, the family that was stolen from us by circumstance and cruel timing. Yes, and if I choose to remain just Etta, they'll never exist. That little girl who loves wooden horses, that boy who reads so carefully, they'll remain nothing more than echoes of what might have been. Etta, no." She stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the oak's shadow and back. "Don't try to make this choice easier for me. You've waited 70 years for this moment. Those children have been waiting even longer, existing in the space between possibility and reality, hoping for the chance to be born." The blood moon hung directly overhead. Now, its crimson light making everything look like it was bathed in fire. Etta could feel the weight of destiny pressing down on her, the accumulated hopes and dreams of generations balanced on the edge of her decision. "If I accept this," she said finally, "if I let myself become Elizabeth while remaining Etta, what happens to the life I've built here, to the people who love me as I am?" "They'll remember you as you were," Harlan said gently. "The bond doesn't erase your identity, it expands it. You'll still be Etta Rose Morrison, but you'll also be Elizabeth Caldwell. All the love you've given and received will remain, along with all the experiences that shaped you into the woman you are today. And our children will inherit both legacies. They'll carry the best of both worlds. Elizabeth's connection to the ancient spirits and Etta's grounding in human love and community. They'll be bridges between past and future, helping to ensure that the old covenants survive while adapting to changing times." Etta looked at the pendant one more time, seeing not just a piece of jewelry, but a key to destiny itself. Taking it would mean accepting responsibility for more than just her own happiness. It would mean becoming part of something larger than herself, a legacy that stretched back generations and forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. "Will you still love me?" she asked suddenly, the question torn from her deepest fears. "If I become someone else as well as myself, will you still love Etta Rose Morrison, or will you only see Elizabeth Caldwell?" Harlan stood and moved to her, cupping her face in his hands with infinite tenderness. "I fell in love with your spirit, not just your form. Whether you're Elizabeth or Etta or both, that essential part of you, the courage, the kindness, the stubborn determination to protect what you care about. That's what captured my heart. That's what I've been waiting 70 years to find again. Then I choose," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I choose love over fear, destiny over safety, us over the easy path." She took the pendant from his hands, and the moment her fingers closed around it, the world exploded into memory and sensation. She was Elizabeth, speaking vows beneath this same oak while snow swirled around them. She was Etta, making a teasing promise to a mysterious stranger in a stable filled with restless horses. She was both women and neither, something new and eternal that encompassed all she had been and all she was meant to become. The transformation lasted only moments, but when it was complete, she understood everything, the true scope of their bond, the reason for their separation, and the magnificent purpose that awaited them. She also understood why the pendant had appeared on this particular night, under this particular moon. "It's time," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "The final ceremony, tonight, while the blood moon witnesses our vows." Harlan nodded, his own transformation evident in the way he stood straighter, more confident, as if the weight of 70 years of uncertainty had finally lifted from his shoulders. "Are you ready, my love?" he asked, using an endearment that felt both completely new and utterly familiar. "I've been ready for longer than I knew," she replied, taking his hand and leading him back beneath the lightning-struck oak. "Let's go home, to each other, and to the future we were always meant to share." Dawn brought with it a sense of urgency that seemed to permeate every corner of Dry Hollow. The blood moon had set hours ago, but its influence lingered in the very air, charging everything with electric anticipation. Etta, who was now fully aware of her dual nature as both herself and Elizabeth, woke to find that the world looked different through her expanded consciousness. Colors were more vivid, sounds carried deeper meaning, and she could sense the emotional undercurrents flowing through the town like underground streams. Most significantly, she could feel Harlan's presence even when he wasn't near, a warm constant in her chest that told her exactly where he was and how he was feeling. He was nervous, she realized, as she dressed in the pre-dawn darkness. Not about their bond. That was as solid as the oak tree itself now, but about the ceremony that lay ahead. After 70 years of waiting, the prospect of finally completing their interrupted vows carried a weight that was almost overwhelming. She found him in the stable, not working but simply standing among the horses, drawing comfort from their peaceful presence. Thunder approached him without fear now, nuzzling his shoulder with the trust that had developed over their weeks together. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly. He turned at the sound of her voice, and she saw her own mixture of anticipation and wonder reflected in his storm-grey eyes. The connection between them had deepened overnight, becoming less like attraction and more like two halves of the same soul, recognizing their completion. "The dreams have stopped," he said. "For the first time in 70 years I slept without seeing visions of what might be. Because tonight they become reality." She moved to his side, and he wrapped his arms around her with the naturalness of long habit. "Are you afraid?" "Terrified," he admitted. "Not of the ceremony itself, but of what comes after. I've been alone for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be part of a family." "You won't be alone in learning," she assured him. "I've never been a mother, never been a wife in the true sense. We'll figure it out together." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their private moment. Doc Brennan appeared in the stable doorway, carrying a bundle wrapped in white cloth and looking every bit as nervous as they felt. "Morning," he said quietly. "Hope you don't mind the early visit, but I couldn't sleep either. Kept thinking about all the preparations we need to make." "What kind of preparations?" Etta asked. Doc unwrapped his bundle, revealing several items that seemed to glow with the same inner light they'd seen in the sacred artifacts. There was a braided rope made from prairie grass and what looked like strands of moonlight, a collection of herbs that filled the air with the scent of rain and sage and something indefinably ancient. And most impressive of all, a ceremonial knife whose blade seemed to be forged from captured starlight. "These belonged to Standing Bear," he explained. "My grandfather kept them after she left, said they were meant for the day when the next spirit." "Marriage took place. I've been caring for them for 40 years, waiting for the right time to pass them on." Harlan examined the knife with reverence, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what it represented. "I've seen blades like this before in the hidden communities. They're used to cut the ceremonial herbs, to carve the binding symbols." "There's more," Doc continued, his voice growing heavy with the weight of responsibility. "Word has spread through town about what's happening tonight. Most folks are supportive, but there are some who—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Some who think what you're doing is unnatural, possibly dangerous. What kind of opposition are we talking about?" Harlan asked, his protective instincts sharpening. "Nothing violent, I don't think, but Preacher Williams has been stirring up talk about devil worship and pagan rituals. He's convinced a few of the more religious families that your ceremony is an affront to God." Etta felt a flash of anger at the narrow-mindedness, but it was quickly tempered by understanding. These were people who had lived their entire lives within the bounds of conventional faith, who had no framework for accepting the ancient spirits that predated their own beliefs. "How many are we talking about?" she asked. "Maybe a dozen families, no more. But they're talking about trying to prevent the ceremony, claiming it's their Christian duty to stop what they see as a corruption of sacred ground. The oak tree isn't on church land," Harlan pointed out. No, but it's close enough to town that they feel justified in taking action. Doc Brennan's expression was grim. Sheriff Coleman is trying to keep the peace, but he's walking a fine line between respecting your rights and preventing a confrontation that could tear the community apart. Before either of them could respond, Widow Macready appeared in the stable doorway, moving with the purposeful stride that usually meant she had strong opinions to share. "Heard voices and thought I'd find you here," she said without preamble. "Came to tell you that there are at least 20 people in town who will stand with you tonight, come what may. We've been talking, and we agree that what you're doing is beautiful and right, regardless of what some small-minded folks might think. Mrs. Macready, we can't ask you to take sides against your neighbors," Etta protested. "You're not asking. We're choosing." The older woman's voice carried the steel that had helped her survive decades of frontier life. "Some of us have lived long enough to recognize genuine love when we see it, and we're not about to let fear and ignorance destroy something precious." "What are you proposing?" Harlan asked. "A circle of protection around the ceremony site. Nothing confrontational, just a quiet presence to ensure you can speak your vows in peace. Doc Brennan will perform the legal portions, the spirits will handle the mystical aspects, and the rest of us will make sure no one interrupts either part." The offer was both touching and concerning. Etta could see how easily a peaceful gathering could escalate into something uglier if the wrong words were spoken or the wrong actions taken. "I don't want anyone getting hurt because of us," she said firmly. "And I don't want anyone preventing you from claiming the happiness you deserve," Mrs. Macready replied with equal firmness. "Besides, most of the troublemakers are just scared of what they don't understand. Once they see that you're not summoning demons or cursing the land, they'll settle down." "But what if they don't?" Harlan asked. "What if our presence here continues to divide the community even after we leave?" Doc Brennan considered this carefully. "Then perhaps it's time for this community to decide what kind of place it wants to be. Whether it's going to be ruled by fear and rigid thinking, or whether it's going to embrace the understanding that love takes many forms and all of them are worthy of respect. In other words," Mrs. Macready added with a slight smile, "you too might be doing us all a favor by forcing us to examine our own hearts." The morning progressed with a strange mixture of ordinary routine and extraordinary preparation. Etta went about her usual stable work, but with the awareness that it would be among the last times she performed these familiar tasks. Harlan helped where he could, his presence a steady comfort even as the anticipation continued to build. Throughout the day, people stopped by to offer their support or simply to wish them well. Sheriff Coleman arrived around noon to discuss security arrangements, his weathered face showing the strain of trying to keep peace between two increasingly polarized factions. "I'll have deputies positioned discreetly around the hill," he assured them. "Nothing visible enough to provoke a confrontation, but enough presence to discourage anyone from getting too rowdy." "What about Preacher Williams?" Etta asked. "I've had a long talk with him about the legal aspects of what you're doing. Whatever his personal feelings, you have every right to hold a wedding ceremony wherever you choose, as long as it's not on private property without permission. And the oak tree? Technically public land, though it's been considered sacred ground by various groups for longer than anyone can remember. I think even the preacher recognizes he's on shaky ground, trying to prevent it." As afternoon faded toward evening, the final preparations began in earnest. Doc Brennan arrived with the ceremonial items, along with a simple white dress that had belonged to Etta's grandmother. The same dress, she realized with a shock of recognition, that Elizabeth had worn at her first wedding ceremony. "How is this possible?" she whispered, touching the fabric that showed no signs of age, despite being over 70 years old. "Some things exist outside of normal time," Harlan explained, his own voice filled with wonder. "The spirits preserve what is needed for the completion of their plans." Mrs. Macready helped her change into the dress, which fit perfectly despite having been made for a woman who had died before Etta was born, As she looked at herself in the small mirror, she could see both identities reflected back. Etta Rose Morrison and Elizabeth Caldwell, past and present united in preparation for a future that would encompass both. "You look beautiful," the older woman said softly. "Your grandmother would be so proud." "Both of them," Etta replied, understanding now that her maternal grandmother and her great-grandmother Elizabeth were both part of the legacy she was claiming. Tonight, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the participants began making their way toward the lightning-struck oak. Etta could feel the power building around the sacred site, responding to the approach of the moment when past and present would finally converge into an eternal future. Tonight, under the witness of stars and spirits, she would complete the vows that had been interrupted by tragedy. Tonight, the waiting would finally end, and the real adventure would begin. The stars emerged one by one as twilight deepened over the prairie, each point of light seeming to pulse in rhythm with Etta's heartbeat. She stood at the base of the lightning-struck oak, wearing her grandmother's wedding dress and feeling the weight of generations settling around her shoulders like a beloved shawl. Around them, the people of Dry Hollow had gathered in a loose circle, some drawn by curiosity, others by genuine affection, and a faithful few by the deep understanding that they were about to witness something that transcended the ordinary bounds of human experience. Widow Macready stood to her right, Doc Brennan to her left, their presence a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone in this momentous transition. Sheriff Coleman had positioned himself discreetly at the edge of the gathering, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid making the ceremony feel like a confrontation. True to his word, Preacher Williams and his followers had remained in town, though Etta could feel their disapproval like a distant storm cloud on the horizon, but none of that mattered now. All that mattered was Harlan, standing before her in the simple black suit he'd worn the day he first arrived in Dry Hollow, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the starlight as he waited for her to join him beneath the sacred canopy. As she took her first step toward him, the lightning-struck branch above their heads began to glow with soft silver light. By the second step, her grandmother's ring, now worn openly on her finger, answered with its own warm radiance. By the third step, Harlan's spirit stone blazed against his chest, and the very air around them shimmered with visible energy. "Friends and neighbors," Doc Brennan's voice carried clearly across the gathered crowd, "we come together tonight to witness the union of two souls who have found their way back to each other across the span of years and the veil of death itself." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some gasps of wonder, others mutters of unease. But the power building around the oak tree seemed to settle over them all, like a benevolent blessing, calming nerves and opening hearts to the possibility of something beyond their everyday understanding. "This is not a ceremony born of convention or convenience," Doc continued, his weathered hands steady as he opened the ancient book that contained the words of spiritual binding. "This is the completion of a covenant made long ago, interrupted by tragedy but never broken, preserved by love that death itself could not diminish." Etta reached Harlan's side and took his hands, feeling the familiar electric connection spark between them. But now there was more. A sense of homecoming so profound it brought tears to her eyes. In his face, she could see both the man she'd fallen in love with over the past weeks and the soul she'd recognized across lifetimes. "Do you, Harlan Tate, also known to the spirits as Joshua Morrison, take this woman to be your wife, in the sight of heaven and earth, in this life and all lives that may follow?" "I do," Harlan replied, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very bones of the earth. "As I have before, as I will again, across all time and distance that may separate us." "And do you, Etta Rose Morrison, also known to the spirits as Elizabeth Caldwell, take this man to be your husband in the sight of heaven and earth, in this life and all lives that may follow?" "I do," she whispered, then stronger. I do with all my heart and soul, in this moment and for all eternity. As the words left her lips, something extraordinary happened. The pocket watch that had belonged to Harlan's grandfather, the one he'd carried through 70 years of wandering, stopped ticking with an audible click that seemed to echo across the gathered crowd. In that moment of perfect silence, time itself seemed to pause, suspended between one heartbeat and the next. "The rings," Doc Brennan said softly, and Harlan reached into his jacket pocket, but what he withdrew wasn't the simple band they'd planned to use. Instead, his hand held two rings that seemed to be forged from living silver, their surfaces flowing like captured moonlight. They'd appeared in his room that morning, as suddenly and mysteriously as the ceremonial knife, bearing engravings that matched those on the oak's glowing branch. "By the power vested in me, by the territory of Kansas, and by the ancient spirits who guard this sacred ground," Doc Brennan intoned, his voice growing stronger as the mystical energy continued to build. "Around them, I now pronounce you husband and wife, bound in love that transcends death, united in purpose that spans lifetimes." As Harlan slipped the ring onto Etta's finger, the world around them began to transform. The grass beneath their feet burst into bloom with wildflowers that had no business growing in late autumn. The air filled with the sound of wind chimes, though no chimes were visible, their crystalline notes creating a melody that seemed to come from the stars themselves. But most miraculous of all, as their lips met in their first kiss as truly married souls, twin bands of silver light appeared on their hands, rings forged not by human hands, but by the very spirits who had watched over their love across the decades, unremovable symbols of a bond that would endure beyond the boundaries of mortal life. The moment their lips parted, the transformation that had been building for weeks finally reached its crescendo. The silver rings on their fingers pulsed with brilliant light, and Etta felt something fundamental shift inside her. Not a loss of herself, but an expansion, as if she'd been living her entire life in a single room and suddenly discovered that the house contained infinite chambers. The changes weren't just internal. Around them, the very landscape began to respond to their completed bond. The lightning-struck oak's damaged trunk began to heal before their eyes, the ancient split slowly closing as new bark grew to cover the old wounds. The glowing branch that had marked their covenant spread its light through the entire tree until every leaf shimmered with silver radiance. But it was the ground itself that provided the most dramatic evidence of their union's power. From the base of the oak, a wave of green spread outward in all directions, not the brown, drought-stressed grass of late autumn, but lush prairie growth that sparkled with dew and bloomed with flowers that released fragrances like liquid starlight. The gathered crowd gasped in wonder as the wave of renewal reached them, bringing with it a sense of peace and healing that settled into their very bones. Mrs. Patterson, who had been battling consumption for months, took her first clear breath in. Memory. Old Tom Henricks straightened his bent back and stood tall for the first time in years. Children laughed with pure joy as butterflies materialized from nowhere to dance around their heads. "Look," Widow Macready whispered, pointing toward the horizon. Soobed. In the distance, dark clouds that had been threatening drought for weeks were dissipating, replaced by gentle formations that promised rain. Not the violent storms that sometimes battered the prairie, but the kind of steady, nourishing precipitation that would ensure good crops and full wells. But the most profound change was in Harlan himself. As Etta watched, the careful control he'd maintained for 70 years simply melted away, replaced by a vitality and warmth that transformed his entire presence. The ancient loneliness that had shadowed his eyes was gone, replaced by a joy so radiant it seemed to light him from within. "It's finished," he said wonderingly, flexing his fingers as if testing whether the silver rings were real. "After all these years, it's finally finished." "No," Etta corrected gently, her own voice carrying, new harmonics that spoke of wisdom gained and destiny accepted. It's just beginning. As if to prove her point, a new vision began to unfold before their eyes. Not the vague, dreamlike images they'd been sharing for weeks, but clear, detailed glimpses of the future that awaited them. They saw themselves traveling westward, following the hidden roads marked on Standing Bear's map. They saw the community that waited for them, the Blessed Valley, where dozens of families like theirs lived in harmony with both the natural world and the spirit realm. They saw their children, not just the two from their dreams, but others who would come later, each one a bridge between the ancient ways and the changing world. They saw those children growing up surrounded by love and understanding, learning to use their gifts responsibly, carrying forward the legacy that had been entrusted to their bloodlines. And beyond even that, they saw the network of communities that would grow from their example, places where the old covenants between spirits and mortals would be honored and preserved, ensuring that wisdom and healing would continue to flow into a world that desperately needed both. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, his weathered face soft with wonder. "I've been law enforcement for 20 years, he said quietly, "and I've never seen anything like what just happened here. Whatever you two are, whatever power you carry, it's nothing but good. We're just people who've been given a responsibility." Etta replied, "The power isn't ours. We're just vessels for something larger than ourselves." "When will you leave?" Doc Brennan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Soon," Harlan said. "The spirits are calling us westward, toward the community that's been waiting for us, but not immediately. We need time to prepare, to say proper goodbyes, and to ensure that what we've started here continues after we're gone," Etta added. "The healing that happened tonight, it's not temporary. The land around Dry Hollow will prosper for generations because of what was accomplished here." As if summoned by her words, a gentle rain began to fall, the first substantial precipitation the area had seen in months. But this wasn't ordinary rain. Each droplet seemed to carry its own inner light, and wherever they touched the ground, new growth sprouted immediately. The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, as if none of them wanted to leave the magic circle that surrounded the oak tree. But they carried with them the peace and healing they'd witnessed, along with the understanding that they'd been present for something that would be remembered and spoken of for generations. As the last of the townspeople made their way back toward Dry Hollow, Etta and Harlan stood alone beneath the oak tree, still glowing with the light of their completed bond. In the distance, they could hear the soft chiming that would become a constant companion, the sound of the spiritual bells that marked their territory, letting all who approached know that this was sacred ground protected by ancient covenants. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Tate?" Harlan asked, offering her his arm with a smile that held 70 years of pent-up happiness. "I am home," she replied, taking his arm and marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side. "Wherever we go from here, as long as we're together, we're home." 6 months later, the spring rains had transformed Dry Hollow into something approaching paradise. Where once the land had been parched and struggling, now green fields stretched to the horizon, dotted with wildflowers that bloomed in profusion. The creek that had run dry for 3 years was flowing again, its waters clear and sweet, supporting fish that sparkled like living jewels in the afternoon sun. Etta stood in the doorway of the small cabin Harlan had built on the hill, overlooking the town, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew. She could feel him moving, for somehow she knew without doubt that it would be a boy, the serious-eyed child from her dreams who would inherit his father's quiet wisdom and his mother's stubborn determination. The wooden cradle that had appeared in their home 3 days ago still took her breath away each time she looked at it. Like the rings on their fingers and the other gifts the spirits had provided, it seemed to have grown rather than been crafted, formed from the living wood of the lightning-struck oak with grain patterns that shifted and flowed like captured wind. "The last of the preparations are finished," Harlan said, joining her in the doorway and wrapping his arms around her from behind. Doc Brennan has all the instructions for maintaining the healing gardens, and Sheriff Coleman understands the signs to watch for if any other spirit-touched travelers pass through. And Mrs. McCready, promise to keep the stable running exactly as you would have until someone else is ready to take over permanently." His voice carried a mixture of sadness and anticipation that perfectly matched her own feelings. She also made me promise to write as soon as we're settled in the valley and to bring the grandchildren for visits when they're old enough to travel. Etta leaned back against his solid warmth, marveling at how natural this felt. The weight of him behind her, the gentle movement of their child beneath her heart, the sense of completeness that had been growing stronger every day since their wedding. Sometimes she could hardly remember what it felt like to be alone, to carry the burdens of daily life without someone to share both the work and the joy. "Are you sad to be leaving?" he asked, his voice gentle with understanding. "Yes and no," she replied honestly. "This place shaped me, gave me the foundation I needed to become who I am. But I think I've given back everything I was meant to give here. It's time to plant new seeds in different soil." As if summoned by their conversation, a delegation from town appeared on the path leading to their cabin. Doc Brennan led the way, followed by Mrs. McCready, Sheriff Coleman, and a handful of others who had become especially dear during their time in Dry Hollow. "Came to see you off properly," Doc Brennan announced, though his smile couldn't quite hide the sadness in his eyes. "Can't have you leaving without a proper goodbye. And without these," Mrs. McCready added, producing a bundle wrapped in one of her finest quilts. "Food for the journey, medicines for the baby when he comes, and a few things to help you remember us." Sheriff Coleman stepped forward with his own offering, a leather pouch that jingled softly with the sound of coins. "Collection from everyone in town," he explained gruffly. "Not charity, mind you, but payment for all the healing you've brought to this place. Seemed only right that you should have something to help you get established in your new home." Etta felt tears prick her eyes at the generosity, but also at the understanding it represented. These people had accepted not just their love, but their destiny, recognizing that some gifts were meant to be shared with the wider world rather than hoarded in any single place. "You've all given us so much more than money or supplies," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given us acceptance, support, and the chance to discover who we were meant to be together. We'll carry that with us wherever we go." The farewells were both heartbreaking and joyful, tears for the friendship that would be missed, laughter for the memories that would endure, and promises to maintain the connections that had been forged in the crucible of supernatural love and community acceptance. As the last of their visitors disappeared down the hill, Etta and Harlan finished loading their wagon with the few possessions they would need for the journey west. The rest, furniture, tools, anything too heavy or cumbersome to transport, would remain as gifts for whoever eventually took over their cabin. "Ready?" Harlan asked as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. "More than ready," she replied, settling beside him and taking one last look at the lightning-struck oak that had witnessed their union. Even in the late afternoon light, the tree still glowed softly, its healing radiance now a permanent beacon for any other spirit-touched souls who might find their way to Dry Hollow. As they rolled away from the town that had sheltered them during their courtship and early marriage, Etta felt the familiar stirring of their child and smiled. By the time they reached the Blessed Valley, he would be born, the first of several children who would carry forward the legacy of love that had been decades in the making. "Tell me about the valley," she said as the miles stretched out before them, following roads that seemed to appear just ahead of their wagon wheels and disappear just behind them, hidden from any eyes not blessed with spirit sight. "It's everything the dreams showed us and more," Harlan replied, his voice warm with anticipation. "Families who understand what we are, children who grow up knowing they're part of something ancient and precious, gardens that flourish because they're tended with both practical knowledge and spiritual wisdom." And it's where our son will take his first steps, speak his first words, learn to carve wooden horses for his little sister, Etta added, one hand on her belly and the other reaching for Harlan's. The story that started with a joke about giving strong sons to a giant cowboy, he said with a chuckle, is finally becoming the reality we always knew it could be. As the sun set behind them and the stars emerged to light their path forward, Etta Rose Tate, formerly Morrison, formerly Caldwell, but always and forever the woman who had chosen love over fear and destiny over safety, settled back for the journey that would take them home to their future. Behind them, the town of Dry Hollow slept peacefully under a blanket of stars, its people dreaming sweeter dreams than they had known in years, its land restored and ready to nurture whatever seeds the future might bring. And ahead of them, somewhere beyond, the horizon, their destiny waited with the patience of spirits who had learned that the best things in life, like the deepest loves, were always worth waiting for.